I'm Tim Black. I'm one of the co-directors of the Social Justice Institute. I was hired through the Social Justice Institute along with my co-director, John Flores, who is also here. John is right here in the middle of the room. John and I were hired under Dr. Rhonda Williams' leadership to help contribute to developing the Institute, and now, as it turns out, we're carrying on its work in the community in her absence. I wanted to say a few words about how this event came about. So about 6 months ago, Khalid Samad called the Institute and said, what could we do to commemorate the Glenville Uprising, 50th anniversary? We said, all right, well, let's start a conversation. And so Khalid and myself and Janice began meeting downstairs here in the library on a weekly basis, and we started the conversation. And the conversation developed, and we decided to take the conversation to a larger group of people. So we started meeting as a planning committee on a weekly basis, and we just had a conversation. What should the commemoration of this significant event be like? In other words, it was a very organic process. We didn't come in and say, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. It grew out of a conversation. I felt personally, as someone who wasn't here during that period of time, didn't live in Cleveland, very privileged to be in the room. And I tried to practice a rather rare skill among academics, and I tried to listen. And admittedly, I am a work in progress when it comes to that. And if you don't believe me, my wife is here. You can ask my wife. But I heard amazing stories. Some were the big picture stories about what has been done to Glenville. Stories about capital disinvestment and then capital reinvestment in terms of gentrification. Stories about redlining and segregation, educational neglect, environmental degradation, and of course policing with impunity. The 400-year story. Others were stories about organized resistance in community spaces like the mosques, the churches, community centers, living rooms. And still others were the stories, the intimate and the more interpersonal stories about the day-to-day, about creating family, about creating community, about connections with neighbors and connections in the community, on the stoops, in the spaces to try to create and live these forces. We will hear these same stories across 2 days. What we have basically done is now invited everyone into this space to tell the stories. And why tell the stories? Because it is a reminder that part of political struggle is about who controls the narrative, who gets to tell the stories. In the next 2 days, we are inviting current and former residents of Glenville and other Clevelanders into this space, and tomorrow, starting at 2 o'clock, at Harkness Chapel at the campus of Case Western Reserve University, we will continue this conversation to claim the narrative and to do so across 4 generations. That's what this event has become, and again, through a very organic process. So in this way, this is what we try to do in the Social Justice Institute. This is how we approach our work. That is to work in community, with community, and for community, which is very different than a lot of university work that tends to work on community. Okay? This is work in community, with community, and for community. So before I introduce my colleague and co-conspirator, Janice Etemon Williams, let me just say a few things about housekeeping and thank a few people. A few things regarding housekeeping. Restrooms, there's restrooms upstairs, but there isn't a lock on the door. So when you're finished in the restroom, leave the door open so others know that it's available. There are also restrooms downstairs. Idea Stream is here, and they're doing some taping if you're interested. This is, of course, voluntary. The room is off to the right here. They will be here for 2 days. They will be airing and telling the story about Glenville, a week-long series beginning on the 23rd. Video, audio, recordings will be presented, as well as it will also be presented online. So if you're interested, here is the room. You feel free to share your story. Some folks to thank. We want to thank the Planning Committee. Planning Committee, please stand up. Everyone who is part of this Planning Committee, please stand up. All right? Thank you. And that's about a third of us, all right? We had some big conversations, 20 to 30 people on the Planning Committee, as you can see on the, from the program. I want to thank the MLK Celebration Committee. I want to thank IdeaStream for co-sponsoring. I want to thank the librarians that have helped to put this together, pull together the materials, Sharon Jefferson at the Glenville branch, William Bradford at the Langston Hughes Library, and especially Chanel Jones, who met with us several times downstairs in the early stages of the conversation. I want to especially thank Lisa Collins from the Social Justice Institute, who does a lot of the invisible work to pull together these kinds of conferences, the kinds of things that don't often get recognized, but are so invaluable to be able to pull these together. So thank you, Lisa. And thank you, Ose Aragon, who is our intern working with Lisa at the table. So say hello to Ose as well. Want to thank the JB Grill, who is providing, who is catering for us today. So thank you. I want to recognize a couple of folks who are here. I want to recognize James Robinault, whose book, Ballots and Bullets, Black Power Politics and Urban Guerrilla Warfare in 1968 Cleveland, was just published. I know this because I ordered an advance copy and it landed on my doorstep last week. Jim is here. Where are you? Jim, please stand up. Of course, Jim is documenting this period, what happened in 1968 Cleveland, and he will be speaking at the City Club at noon on Friday about his book. And while we're talking about books, I also want to recognize Don Freeman in his most recently published book, Reflections of a Resolute Radical. Where is Don? Don, please. He's up here in front. He's pulling out a copy, I think. I mean, this book reads like a who's who of radical politics in the 1960s. It covers, of course, 1968, but much more. It is a must-read, and we will have Don back in the Social Justice Institute this fall for a book signing at the university. And now to my co-conspirator, Janice Etemon. Many of you know Janice Etemon. She probably doesn't. There it is. There it is. Thank you, Don. Janice Etemon Williams was born in Huff and raised in Glenville. She's been an advocate and activist for access and excellence in education for young people for more than 25 years. Her services have been shared through the years while employed at Tri-C Metro Campus, Vocational Guidance Services, the now Cleveland Metropolitan School District, and other institutions, and currently the focus group at Case Western Reserve University, where she directs campus to community-based outreach programs. She devotes her time to many organizations and efforts whose mission is the empowerment of community. She is a graduate of Hawkins School, received her undergraduate degree from Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois, and is a graduate of the Weatherhead School of Management and the Mandel School of Case Western Reserve University. Ms. Etemon serves on the university's Social Justice Institute leadership team, and a valuable colleague on that, on our leadership team. The Staff's Advisory Council Community Service Committee, on the Communications Committee for the African American Alumni Association, as the Northeast Ohio area representative for the Northwestern Black Alumni Association, as the Case Western Reserve University campus advisor to several students' leadership groups, and is engaged in numerous community-based initiatives. I'm exhausted just reading it. She is a 2009 recipient of the President's Award for Distinguished Service at CWRU and a recipient of awards from other organizations recognizing her service to community. Ms. Etemon is and has always been proud to call the city of Cleveland her home. Please welcome Janice Etemon.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you. I always like to begin with call and response, and welcome. We are so excited that you're here. Look at this crowd. This room is almost full, and that's what we wanted, but we didn't know if we were going to get it. So thank you all for coming and participating in this very important conversation. And welcome to the MLK branch of the Cleveland Public Library, one of our longtime partners in progress and programs. Glen, a lush valley, usually with water running. Glenville, incorporated as a village in 1870. According to the Encyclopedia of Cleveland History, shady, thick glens through which little streams tumbled gave the area its picturesque name. Just right and ripe for farming. First by New Englanders, then immigrants from Scotland, Ireland, and England. Produce vendors from Germany followed. At the turn of the last century, it was a summer residence for Cleveland's affluent families because of its Lake Erie location. Bracknell became its own village, and Glenville was annexed to the city of Cleveland in 1905. Beginning around World War I, and by 1930, Glenville was largely Jewish, with a growing African American population. Growing from the 1950s into the 1960s, it became largely black. Glenville, where the Jephthah Wade and J.D. Rockefeller estates meet. Glenville, home of the Cultural Gardens, which are the original peace gardens in the United States. The most beautiful MLK Boulevard in the United States runs through Rockefeller Park, which is in Glenville. Glenville, the first neighborhood in Cleveland with not one, but two historic districts. Glenville, home to Superman and Superfly. Authors and athletes, barbers and bakers, educators and innovators, journalists and journeyman electricians, landscapers and lawyers, principals and preachers, and politicians, tailors and technicians, restaurateurs and entrepreneurs, all side by side in Glenville. Olympians, Emmy, Grammy, and Tony Award winners are from Glenville. U.S. Senator Howard Metzenbaum, Congresswoman Stephanie Tubbs Jones, Indians owner Ted Banda, former Mayor Michael R. White, London and LA-based keyboard artists who played and sang with Prince, Frank McComb, Glenville class of '89, are from the neighborhood. Glenville, the first neighborhood in Cleveland with its own Hall of Fame. Not high school Hall of Fame, but neighborhood Hall of Fame. Robert and Julian Madison built their first multi-story building where they lived, in Glenville. Jesse Owens may have run for East Tech, Ohio State University, and the United States, but he honed those gifts as a resident of Glenville. Glenville, Northeast Ohio's original Gold Coast. It has known greatness and glory, but also trials and triumphs, grit and grief, but through it all, maintaining a sense of pride and moments of grace. That's the Glenville that I know and was raised in. Langston Hughes once said in his poem, Mother to Son, "Don't you sit down on the steps, 'cause you find it's kind of hard. Don't you fall now, for I is still going. Honey, I is still climbing, and life for me ain't been no crystal stair." We know that through it all, life for us in community has not necessarily been a crystal stair, but we still going and we still climbing. That's Glenville. The activity of the Civil Rights Movement and the Black Power movements are inextricably tied to Cleveland. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. used Cleveland as his base in the North. He participated in both of Carl Stokes' election campaigns in 1965 and in 1967. The Cleveland chapter of SCLC was chartered with the help of several Glenville pastors, including those from Great Abyssinia Baptist Church, Corey United Methodist Church, and Bethany Baptist Church, right down the street on East 105th Street. Dr. King spoke in community many times, including at East 105th and Superior, Eddy Road and St. Clair, and at Glenville High School. He was in Cleveland the night that Carl B. Stokes was elected the first African-American mayor of a major city in 1967. He returned to Cleveland at the beginning of 1968 and actually was scheduled to be here April the 10th, 1968. As we all know, unfortunately, he was slain April the 4th, 1968. The issues that Dr. King and Mayor Stokes sought to address during the movement, which were education, employment, economic development, housing, public health, and safety and policing that led to the Glenville Uprising of 1968 are still with us today. As Dr. Tim Black said, we had organic conversations about this. And when we talked about this, we knew that there was a government response and narrative. We knew that there was a police response and narrative. We knew that there was a media response and narrative, but there had never been a conversation with the residents about what happened that led to the uprising itself and its aftermath. So that's the conversation that we want to have with you today. When we first discussed doing this, and especially when we talked about identifying a facilitator and moderator, my first thought was to call Dr. Raymond Wimbush. And I did. And I talked him into doing this. Dr. Raymond Wimbush was born actually in Pittsburgh, but he came to Cleveland with his family so that his family could seek better employment and housing and operate in a way that was less discriminatory when he was actually in his mother's arms. He was born in March and they were here before he was a year old. And he was raised at the border of Huff and Glenville. He is an educator, lifelong activist. He attended Oakwood College, which is now Oakwood University in Huntsville, Alabama, and he received his master's and his PhD from the University of Chicago. I first became aware of his work actually in 1989 when he was employed at Cleveland State University. And I was employed at Cleveland Public Schools at the time, and I always took my students down to whatever activities they had that were community and youth-based at Cleveland State. And I became aware of the man and his work at that time, and had long admired the way that he worked and the way that he connected, especially with young people. I've been following his career, so when he left here, I made sure that I knew where he was, and I think it was in the mid-90s when he was at Fisk. Case Western Reserve University is a Fisk partner, and there we reconnected when he was the director of the Race Relations Institute at Fisk. From there, he went on to Morgan State University, where he is now a research professor and the director of the Urban Research Institute at Morgan State University, and he is also the founder of the Warrior Project. And since we're sharing titles, this is his latest book. It's called The Warrior Method, which is used to empower African American men. So you are welcome to order it. And I'm glad that he is here to help us facilitate this conversation today. So it is my distinct pleasure to welcome to the podium Dr. Raymond Wimbush.
Thank you, Janice. Can everybody hear me? This mic ain't. Can you hear me now? Okay. The first three words I want to say is well, well, well. When I was at Cleveland State in 1989, I think from then until now, I was whiteballed in speaking in my own town. Somebody told me before the meeting that, what is that text in the Bible about a prophet is not recognized or something like that. And so I was really happy when Janice asked me to, moderate this discussion. She gave me 15 minutes before we introduce our illustrious panel to summarize what took 400 years to do. So I want to start off by, bringing you greetings from Morgan State University, where I teach now and have been for the past 16 years. If you like music, Morgan State gave you Denise Williams. Y'all know her? Okay. If you like football, Morgan State gave you Leroy Kelly, who used to be the running back for the Cleveland Browns. They need him now. If you like politics, Morgan State gave us Kwesi Mfume, the former head of the NAACP. Business, our newest building on campus, is the Earl Graves School of Business. And probably our greatest gift was a sister who graduated there in 1918 from our high school by the name of Zora Neale Hurston. If you...
Turn you up, they're not hearing you in the back.
Okay.
Can you pull that up just a little bit?
Okay. So if you haven't read Their Eyes Were Watching God, you've missed half your life. This is her new book, by the way, which was just published about a month ago, Barracoon, and they did not allow her to publish this book back in 1927. So read it. I'm reading it right now. It's a powerful book about the last survivor of the transatlantic slave trade. Okay, so what I want to do, again, I only have 15 minutes. I'm going to adhere to the time. I'm going to ask some questions, and I want you to answer yes or no to these questions. It's about Cleveland. First of all, are there problems with African or American African students in the public schools in Cleveland? Yes. Number two, economic development in the African American community is slow and unemployment is high. Yes. The third one, there are public health challenges in Cleveland, drugs, lead in the water, and so forth. Yes. Two more. There's a problem of housing in Cleveland, and there's a large amount of homeless people in Cleveland. Yes. And number five, there are problems with the police department in Cleveland. Yes. Okay, now, I don't know the answer to all of those questions. I don't even know what the answers to those questions are, but they are the same for Baltimore, Chicago, Detroit, Atlanta, Memphis, LA, and any other city that you might name. So one of the things I think we have to do as black folk is that we have to think of white supremacy racism as a system. It's not just an individual behavior. We know, for example, that the president or whatever you want to call him of the United States is a white supremacist. We know that. But to say that he is just a white supremacist, it's about the entire system of white supremacy, which operates not only here in Cleveland, but around the world. So that's the first thing I want you to think about. There were three major events that led to a fourth event in 1968 in Cleveland. People forget that in February of that year, the Kerner Commission report was published, and it was an indictment about racism throughout the United States. Uprisings that happened in Watts, in New York, Newark, and other places, and the Kerner Commission, run by the governor of Illinois, wrote about this. The second major event was the assassination of Dr. King on April the 4th of 1968. And the third event was the assassination of RFK, Robert Kennedy, on June 6, 1968. So national affairs were on the minds of Clevelanders as well as black people all over this United States because there were national stories related to race. In Cleveland in 1964, how many of you remember or know about the murder of Bruce Klunder? run over by a bulldozer. I remember myself, my mother would not let us go to school in 1964. We had freedom schools. Some of you know what I'm talking. We went to churches and we struck. It was the largest strike in history of students in a Cleveland public school system at that time. I was living on Huff Avenue, 9208 Huff Avenue, in 1966 when the Huff insurrection occurred, which began at 79th and Huff, when two sex workers asked to raise money for one of their dead sex workers in a bar and put a can there to raise money. And the bar owners at that time, who were white, said that no niggers could raise money or drink ice water in his bar. It's a long story. I have time to go into that. On July 20th, 1966, I was working at Mount Sinai Hospital as an orderly right after I had graduated from John Adams High School, and I was unaware that there was a curfew, Don, when I was walking from 93rd down to 105th, where Mount Sinai was located, and a National Guard pointed a submachine gun at me and said, "Where are you going?" And it's something when you're looking down the barrel of a submachine gun. And I told him I was going down to the hospital to work, the 11 to 7 shift. And he said, "Don't you know that there's a curfew, boy?" And I didn't know, so I said no. And he said, "Well, you get off the street as soon as you can." So I walked down Ansel, some of you know where this is, until I got down there. In 1967, the city exhaled slightly because Mayor Carl Stokes was elected as the mayor, and the city was, I don't want to say calm, but it was like a breather between the Huff insurrection and the Glenville insurrection that came in 1968. And as one of our speakers already has said, there's all these, quote, official narratives of what happened in Glenville in 1968. The Cleveland Police Department's narrative, the state troopers' narrative, and one that we often forget, COINTELPRO. And I hope we hear something about that. Y'all know what COINTELPRO, I don't want to explain all that stuff, but COINTELPRO was operating in Cleveland at that time. It was established by that illustrious FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover, in 1956. We didn't know about it until the hearings that took place in the Congress in 1975, but it operated and disrupted a variety of things throughout the 1950s, 60s, and even into the early 70s. So what I want to do today is talk, the first panel that we have is setting the table, if you look at your program. And I want to just ask the panel some questions, and please introduce yourselves, because I don't want, and don't take more than 30 seconds. You know, sometimes people introduce themselves for like 6 hours or something, you know. And I know y'all ain't gonna do that anyway. So I want to begin by asking the panel a question. What was the Glenville we knew leading up to 1968? Anybody on the panel? Just, I'm gonna be like Oprah and walk around with this. Can I walk around with this?
We have mics. We have mics.
Oh, they got mics. Okay, good. Okay. So what was Glenville like before 1968?
Glenville was moving from the Gold Coast to the Lost Coast in that period of time. It had not been lost by 1968, but it was on its way.
Okay.
But like
Anybody
I
else?
said, starting out from the end of World War II, it was the Gold Coast, place where the, if you want to call it the black bourgeoisie in Cleveland, chose to live after World War II. Of course, that was no longer the case in 1968.
James Page, I was 15, 16 years old in this time frame that Ray is talking about. And from my point of view, Glenville was just like Don said, but we just knew that all of the wealthier black people stayed there. They had owned houses and stuff. I lived in the project, 2558 East 43rd and Case Court. I lived right around the corner, actually from where Carl Stokes and Will Stokes grew up at. I didn't know them, but that's how we saw Glenville. Okay, that's where all of the more wealthy black and professional black people live. Because of course, we were Negroes back then, and we were still segregated back then.
I think that along with what we define as the black bourgeoisie, we had another strand. We had another strand that was present along with the professional people. And a friend of mine defined this group of people as the shade Negroes. And I'm indebted to this brother who is no longer living. He said there have always been three kinds of black people in this country: the house Negroes, the field Negroes, and the shade Negroes. The shade Negroes were the ones who helped to establish an underground economy that enabled us to create our own institutions, mainly in the area of education, entertainment, but a lot of that money was passed out among us so that we could establish, for instance, our own hospital in Glenville. The doctors put in the money they had, but we always had the underground economists who were there to back up and to fill in the gaps. And that continued into the 60s. A lot of people do not know that there were those who were called sporting life people who supported our struggles financially, but were not out there in the streets visible. And rarely do they ever get their proper recognition. These people were, as Miles defined his father, these were race men and women. They loved black people. They loved who we are. They loved how we are. They loved our style, everything. Ron O'Neal is an example of someone who came from that. I am an example. My father was the numbers man, not in Glenville, but in the central part of the city, in the lower part of Kinsman. My husband, who rarely talks about his mother's people, they were Blackmans, and they owned the Cafe Society and the Key Club, all those magnificent places we used to go and party and fellowship and sistership and just have a wonderful time. Mr. Deering was supported by those people. When those of us who had regular jobs didn't have any money, they went every day so he could keep his business flourishing. And I just wanted to insert that because I think it's time to give every aspect of our community their just due.
Ashe. Oh, okay. Well, 3 generations of my family have lived in Glenville. I've lived in Glenville my entire life. To me, it was a whole world, even though I had 2 parents who made sure that we had a full life experience and took us everywhere in the city of Cleveland, including to, what was the hockey team's name back in the day?
Barons.
Yeah, the Barons game, and we'd be the only black people there. But they wanted us to know that, yeah, there's 2 worlds and you have a place in both of them. And Glenville, just to give you an example, just to give you an example, the man who lived next door to me, Dr. Charles Garvin, was the first African-American to buy property on Wade Park in the 1920s. His house was bombed twice. He threw the second bomb back out the window. That's the kind of brother he was. Howard alumni. I went to Doane Elementary School with numbers runners' children, with preachers' children. My dentist lived on the left of me. My doctor lived on the right of me. There were 7 doctors that lived in our neighborhood. I rode my bike to Donald White's house, who was the first black cellist to play for the orchestra, who lived in Glenville on Shakespeare. We went to the library and had story hour on 105th Street across from Doane with Roger May Jones, who was a Karamu dancer. We walked to the movie theater on 105th to the Liberty and sat in the balcony and threw popcorn out. It was the center of my world. And I remember for one summer, summer of 1969, when they went to the moon, my mother, wanting us to have a full life experience, had sent me to Chautauqua Institution in Chautauqua, New York, where I was one of 4 black people for 8 weeks. And when she brought me home and we got off of I-90 on Eddy Road, I literally hung out the window because I was back in Glenville and I just wanted to take it all in. We ate at Deering's, we worshiped. I remember my mother dropping my father off at Corey when Malcolm X came to speak there, him working with Martin Luther King when he came here. And just, who remembers Playboy's menswear? Yeah. 105th and Superior, you could buy anything you want. You could walk to the store and buy anything you wanted in Glenville, get anything you wanted, anything you needed, professional service, numbers, barbecue, catering, anything that you needed, you could find it in Glenville. And I wouldn't have traded that. I would not trade that experience for anything in the world. That's why I still live there. Sherry Tolliver.
That is Stanley Tolliver's daughter. Most of you know that. Let me ask you this. What is, and you kind of got into some of that, Sherry, what is missing now, not only in Glenville, but a variety of black communities throughout the United States that was there then? Like, I remember the same experience on Huff. That you could get anything within a half-a-mile radius of where you live. What is missing? What's different now in Glenville?
There is no, let's say, remnants of what I started calling the black meritocracy, that is, the black professional class. In other words, in Glenville today, the youth have no mentors to speak of. They have very few people that can provide them any guidance. And especially this is deplorable given the fact that very few, I don't know what percentage of the homes or households in Glenville today have 2 parents, but obviously there are very few. So that what we have is just a total vacuum in terms of leadership.
Okay. James.
Yes, my name is Mississippi Charles Bevel, and I want to speak in terms of my family's engagement with Glenville about the working class. My first encounter with Glenville was in 1951, the year that I had come up from Mississippi. And I would ride the bus all the way out from 79th and Kinsman out to 105 and Pierpoint to babysit for an older sister and her husband who were renting a 3rd floor apartment. Now, I think I can say without exaggerating that I have more relatives in Glenville than perhaps all of you combined. I was from a family of 17 siblings, all up from Mississippi, and they love to make love. So through the next few generations, scattered all over Glenville and Collinwood, all my grandnieces and so forth and so on, grandnieces and nephews, And I left Glenville in 1956. Now we're here to celebrate or to commemorate the Glenville shootout of 1968. But the first Glenville shootout that I encountered occurred in 1956. My brother-in-law and his wife, who all worked at the GM plant out there on Court Road, were having a dispute one Friday night. And she ran out of the house because he had picked up his gun. And she had made it out of the house, but him stumbling down the stairway shot out the window in the staircase. And I decided that it was about time that I got the hell out of Glenville myself. So that was the first Glenville shootout that I encountered. But it was, my family, as I said, were just working class people. The steel mill, the motor car companies, the hotels, but they were a part of that whole migration out of other sections of Cleveland into Glenville during the 50s and the 60s.
Okay, Joan, you want to? Yeah.
Well, I was thinking about 105 and all the things that you mentioned, but also remember the black-owned flower shop, and I can't...
Cloud,
of course. And then there was a bike store owned by a sweet, round, white woman, but it was just a great store because of repairs and because you could go in and do anything. So I'm from Syracuse, New York, but I live on Kempton, and living in Kempton since, I'm going to mix up dates. I lived in Kempton almost 70 years of my 89. So I raised 4 children there. And when the kids were small, you know, girls always had sleepovers. Boys didn't do that. So because I had 2 boys and 2 girls, what I established on Kempton Avenue was a backyard camp out for the boys. And boys from all over the neighborhood came that night and toasted marshmallows and talked and made a lot of noise. I warned the neighbors the day before that there'd be noisy boys in the backyard. One night, and I went upstairs, but one of those nights, I looked out of the window, and my son Robbie, 7 and 8 years old, was organizing races in the middle of the street at 3 a.m. Makes a lot of sense. I've been here. I'm from Syracuse, but because I'm 89, I've been here more of my life than in my growing up. It's a part of me. And when you mentioned 105, my church was on 105, Presbyterian Church, with a white minister named Shaner, wonderful couple, and they lived on my block. They had 3 children. Hallie was the same age as my TC, and then 2 boys, Brad and Matt. Well, Hallie and TC and my TC were 3 years old, and the magical part of that age was that they were so grown up. Hallie lived on the corner, I lived almost near the other end, and they were big enough girls to walk back and forth to each other's houses at 3 without holding their mother's hand. I don't know if they looked up to see that Brenda Shaner was standing at that door, and I was standing at my door just to see if they made it, but they always did. The Shaners were a family that, because of the Glenville uprising, they had to move out of the neighborhood. We continue to be friends, and this isn't before '68, but I wanted to tell you about that friendship because Brad rode a motorcycle from the East Coast to make sure that I knew of his mother's passing. And he told me that Brenda, 2 stories. One was that a friend in Brenda's congregation had lost a baby, and that friend asked Brenda to learn the lullaby that she used to sing to her baby so that Brenda could sing it to the baby in heaven. Brad also told me that I was, quote, royalty to the Shaner family. I also got to sit on his motorcycle. Sit, not ride.
Thank you very much. What I want to do now, who knew Ahmed Evans? Almost everybody. Somebody talk about Ahmed, because there's always been this controversy about whether or not he did some of the things that the police did. But let's talk about that. Somebody.
Well, I first met Ahmed Evans when he was living in an apartment on the corner of Lakeview and Hopkins. Now, I don't know how soon that was after he had essentially been discharged from the armed forces, but even then, it was evident to me that in terms of his orientation, and I'll call it armed self-defense, that he, when Malcolm X said, we must wage our struggle in terms of the ballot or the bullet, that in terms of Ahmed Evans, he didn't think that the ballot would suffice. So obviously that meant ultimately the bullet would come into play. But I have to stress that he was not advocating that we should perpetrate violence, but we should be definitely prepared to defend ourselves. And I think that's the key in terms of all the controversy about Ahmed Evans, is that we don't realize that he was not a perpetrator of violence, but a person who was a defender in terms of the right of African Americans to defend themselves from violence.
I think, hold on, go ahead. I think that
I was asked to just stand up in place, just to project.
Stand up?
Yeah, to try to project. We're challenged by some of the AV material.
okay, sometimes my voice drops, so if you're not hearing me, just raise your hand, okay? My husband and I from the time we got married, we chose to live in Glenville. It was very deliberate. We both, in terms of our education, our skill level, we could have lived anywhere. But because I went to Fisk University, and I had a life-changing experience at Fisk. When I was 18 years old, I stayed for commencement. I went there when I was 17, so the first commencement of that year, I was 18. And the honored guest was W.E.B. Du Bois. And I knew about him because my mother had been a school teacher in Georgia, in the bush, one-room schoolhouse, that whole thing. And she had books on Black history, so I knew who he was. And one particular afternoon, I was walking across campus, and a friend was with me, and who do we see coming toward us but W.E.B. Du Bois? And I rarely am at a loss for words. I'm very verbal. I'm an Aquarian, so you know we live in our heads and comes out our mouths. But I was speechless. And he was just a little taller than me. And he walked up to us. I'm standing there with my mouth hanging open. And he introduced himself. And then he immediately pivoted the conversation to us. And he wanted to know my name and my friend's name and where we were from and what we were majoring in. And his parting remark was, I hope you have a good life. I hope you have a successful life. But whatever you do, use your skills and your gifts for the advancement of our people. I was 18, I never forgot that. And when I met my husband again, because I had known him when I was 12, but we got reacquainted as adults, and he said to me that I have made a commitment about how I will live my life. And I want you to know that nothing and no one comes before my commitment to the liberation of our people. Blew me away. I had never heard a young man talk like that. But this seed had been planted by the great one. I call him Fisk University's greatest graduate to this day. That includes me in that number. Okay? But I'm just a little levity. But it's funny how 15 minutes, 5 minutes can change your whole life. So as an elder, when I see young people, I try to get in at least 5 minutes. Plant a seed, drop a seed, let it go. So we decided to live in a community that was obviously in decline, because the people who would be our neighbors were the people who would need us most. And what happened was that we started having meetings in our home on the 3rd floor in one of those big houses in Glenville. And all kinds of people came. And Fred Ahmed Evans was one of the people who came. Because in those days, we did not isolate ourselves in little subgroups. We all intermingled. We had people who were Baptists, people who were Muslims, people who were culturalists, people who were nationalists, people who were Republicans, people who were Democrats, people who were wannabes, the whole 9 yards. We had people as young as 15 in our home. And we had people as old as 90. And we all benefited from all those different age groups. A couple of the older people almost got in a fist fight about who was right, Trotsky or Lenin. We had to break them up. I mean, they could barely walk, but they were like, where's my gun? You know, it was just drama all the time. But I say this because in my house, we had very strict house rules. You couldn't do drugs in our house. You couldn't use any kind of language in our house because we had children. And our rule was you have to respect our children. And if I allow you to come in and do drugs, this little boy that's sitting here acting all innocent and you think he's not noticing, when he's 15, he's going to rub that in my face. So Fred enjoyed a little pot, you know, that was known. But whenever he came to our home for our meetings, his behavior was impeccable. He was very soft-spoken, like most men who are dangerous. He didn't raise his voice often. My father was like that. When he raised his voice, it was all over. You know, you were getting up or being thrown out or whatever. But he respected our point of view. And he told us, Donald, you and Norma Jean are mental warriors. He said, I'm a physical warrior. When they come for you, call me. I will be there. So he was more like our protector. The people in the neighborhood never feared his group. Never, ever. It was very clear that they are the group among us who are the fighters. If need be. They never bothered anybody, but you knew they were not brothers to be messed with. And so I just wanted to give that personal. And we met on a weekly basis, so we interacted frequently. And never, ever did I see him conduct himself in a manner that was unbecoming.
This is secondhand because I was a child when I heard these stories, and so they may not be completely accurate, but I do want to say I did meet Ahmed because my father was his attorney before the uprising. We went to his shop, he came to my father's office, and he came to my mother's bookstore. My mother had at the time, first it was a Negro history bookstore, and then it was redesignated a Black history bookstore on 105th and Superior, and he would come in there and buy books and talk to my mother. And we went to his shop, and my father told me that Ahmed was, as most Black nationalists and militants at that time, felt that the nonviolent movement was ineffective and it was a sellout kind of thing, and he had no, he did not take to Dr. King's methodology well. My father and he would debate about this and say there was room at the table for every person in the movement, and he told Ahmed Ahmed told him he wanted to meet Martin Luther King, and my father introduced him to Dr. King. And Ahmed had been telling people, don't vote, it's the ballot or the bullet, it doesn't make any difference if you vote, it's a trap and all that. He talked to Dr. King and met with him, and my father said it was a transformative moment, just like when he met Dr. King and saw how powerful he was and how dedicated he was to what he was doing. And he started working with him and saying, this is the way we need to do things. We can change things without violence. There's hope. There's some positive things to this. And he helped with the voter registration, some other things for Stokes's election. But when Dr. King was killed, Dr. King invited Ahmed to come and sit in the ghetto grand jury, which they had in Huff with Lewis Robinson, my father, Walter Orange, I think, and not Walter, somebody Orange. Was Walter James Orange? James Orange. And where people came and gave eyewitnesses accounts of police brutality and slum-lord living conditions and things like that. And when Ahmed saw these brothers doing these things and trying to organize the community and do this work, he was on board, and he had a newfound respect for Dr. King and thought that nonviolence might be a possibility. And then when he was killed, all bets were off. He said, Brother Stan, if they can kill him, the rest of us don't have a chance. He said that he was the best friend that they had, and they killed him. And so what does that tell you about their respect for nonviolence? And he said the Black community has to protect itself by any means necessary. But I just wanted to share with you that that window was there, that he was receptive to the possibility of nonviolence and organizing being a transformative force. And like many people, once Dr. King was killed, that was the second transformative moment. A lot of memories, but I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
I want to save some room for our questions and answers, but why did the police start harassing? That's the only words that I can think of. Ahmed. I mean, he was doing things in his community that most people within that Glenville community think they were very positive. Why did the police start harassing him? Yeah.
I want to say I have to disagree with you on one point, because there was a lot of fear among people that did not understand black militancy and all those things. There are people that they had problems with Dr. King, so they had problems with with Ahmed, But if you study that era, the FBI and the government were harassing anybody that was trying to make change, including Dr. King, including the Freedom Riders, including boycotters, whatever the women's movement. They had plants, they had spies, they had informers, and anybody that was trying to bring about any kind of social change. So Ahmed was just one of anybody that was trying to do something. They were being surveyed, they were being followed, they were being watched. And because they were black men buying guns, that made them a threat, as it still is today. I've been wanting to say this in public a long time. We keep talking about gun reform. I'm willing to bet you you can buy a gun at a gun show without any ID. I guarantee you, if a busload of black men got on a bus and went to Kentucky to a gun show to buy, it would be a landmark day in American history. If we want real gun reform, let's get on buses and go across the state line and go buy guns with no ID and no background check and see what happens. That aside, that he was being harassed because he was confronting the racism and the police harassment and the conditions that black people were facing. And he was not doing it humble, head in hand. He was saying, this is wrong and we intend to fix it. And that made him a threat, as it still makes people threats today that stand up to oppression and injustice. So there's no puzzle,
I think there's a myth about, a lot of young people will say, Black Lives Matter. They'll say things like, this is not your grandfather's civil rights movement. Because Dr. King has been, because Dr. King has been held up as the ideal, but there's a book out by Akinyele Umoja called We Will Shoot Back. Mm-hmm. And we should all read that book, because it tells about how Dr. King owned guns. And when he was in Montgomery, the only reason why they didn't give him a permit to carry a gun was because he was leading the boycott, Montgomery bus boycott. So I think that there's a lot of myths about guns. And when I read about that period in Glenville, it seems like the only reason that the cops were so much on him was because he was organizing the community. And there were black folk in Glenville that felt bad about that, felt nervous about that. Yes, ma'am.
And I think there's another aspect to people being uncomfortable with us having guns.
Yes.
Most people think if we were in power or powerful, there would be retribution, because there is a law of karma.
That's right.
What goes around comes around.
That's right.
And people know our history. I have met people from other countries who knew our history and know what has been done to us. And the miracle is that we're still here, period. And to be here and to still be able to create a culture that engulfs the whole world.
That's right.
Everything, our music, our art, everything, our language. We change the language in this country every 5 years.
That's right.
Just by JoJo and Tutu in the hood. You know, they start saying something, and pretty soon, you know, the commentators on cable are saying it, you know? So with that kind of power, there is always that fear that eventually, and they put themselves in our position. I have had friends of European descent said, hey, if I were black, I'd be in the street every day, every night, shooting everything moving that didn't look like me. They said this to me, you know? So they are puzzled when you say, no, we just want to defend what's ours. But that is a strand that most people don't want to talk about that. Because there are universal laws that rule not only the universe, but us too. You know, you can label them whatever you want. But in our study sessions every week, we weren't studying just how to beat up on other people. Right. We were studying how to create a world that is embracing and loving and just to everybody. That was our aim. You know, we weren't about just getting down, fighting. So I think that's a piece of the puzzle also.
I take this opportunity to stress in terms of from the Glenville shootout in 1968 up to this very moment, and even before the Glenville shootout. Police have been able to kill, especially African-American men, males, with impunity, without being punished. Now, the nitty-gritty of all this, that in terms of my soulmate and I, we are still in an organization called the Committee for Social Justice, because we ain't getting justice in terms of the behavior of the police. Now, what I have to stress in terms of from the Glenville shootout to November 29th, 2012, what I call the Cleveland Atrocity, which occurred adjacent to Glenville in East Cleveland, when approximately 11 to 13 police pumped 137 shots into two unarmed, non-criminal African Americans, Timothy Russell and Melissa Williams. And to this moment, the only one of those 11 to 13 police who pumped those 137 shots into their bodies that has been punished to any degree, and that is Michael Brillo, who fired 47 of those shots himself. And the less said, the better in terms of a judge whose last name is O'Donnell, acquitted him in common pleas court for having pumped those 47 shots. And the only thing that has happened to him is he's been fired. Now, in terms of to stress how deplorable the situation is even more, Mayor Frank Jackson fired 6 of these perpetrators of the 137 shots. And the arbitrator of the case chose to only fire one, Michael Brillo. The other 5, the arbitrator overruled the mayor, and those police were reinstated, and they're back on the streets now. So this means that in terms of one of the, probably the worst atrocity in the history of the United States that has been committed to African Americans, it occurred here in Cleveland. The only thing that even approaches it in terms of the magnitude of the violence was the murder, well, not the murder, but the killing of Bonnie and Clyde, 2 notorious armed criminals in which the law enforcement fired 167 shots. But that's the only thing that exceeds what happened here in Cleveland. And what I'm going to take this opportunity to stress is that in terms of dealing with what we're talking about, we've got to deal with the fact that the arbitrators of these cases reinforce and perpetuate this impunity which the police have in terms of killing African Americans and virtually no punishment. And that one of the things that we've got to deal with is that we have got to change the mode of arbitration of police who kill unarmed human beings. So I want to stress that one of the things that we've got to address is arbitration of police.
You know, I have a colleague of mine, and he says that the reason why white police kill black folk, and I would probably expand it to white people kill black folk, is because there's no consequences in doing that. There's no consequences whatsoever. I'm always struck by when 3 years ago in that Charleston church, when the people were killed by Dylan Roof over a Bible study, that news reporters were always asked, do you forgive him? You know, and we're supposed to say, yes, we do. And I think that the reason why they ask us to forgive is a way of saying, we want to see how much your people will allow us to kill you people. And I think we should start saying, no, we don't forgive them. You know, not at all. And I'm writing a paper now called Pathological Forgiveness. I mean, some forgiveness is pathological, and we shouldn't do that. We've got about 10 more minutes. Any questions from the audience that you want to say something or ask a question about? Any questions? Yes, ma'am.
I'd just like to say that although this is about the Glenville area, it's going on all over.
Oh, yeah.
We are still being murdered by the police, by the system. And we, as black people, need to get up off of our dust and do something. We cannot wait for the blue wave. We cannot wait for the November elections. It's time for us to get feet in the street. That's right. Trump is building concentration camps all over. And it's not just for immigrants. It's for all black and brown people. And we may not get to November. So it's time for us as a race to come together. I've been to rallies, I've been to meetings, and 90% of the time, I see a sprinkling of black people. White people are out there fighting for us. During the civil rights movement, I lived in Vicksburg, Mississippi. I marched with Dr. King and the Freedom Riders. The Freedom Riders lived in my mother's home. They taught us black history because it was not being taught in Mississippi. We've marched up the hills of Vicksburg and knocked on doors to get black people to vote. And even then, it was hard to get black people out to do and encourage them to work for themselves. I'm asking today that black people go to refusefascism.org and come out and join us. Be a part of working to do something for ourselves. That's all I've got to say.
Okay, let's start here and then over here. Either way. Okay, go ahead.
I'd like to make a suggestion. I come to see seminars and sister,
Freeman.
Sister Norma Freeman and brother Donnie couldn't get that happen. But I'm saying I have been to these things, these situations since I've been here in Cleveland for about 30 years. And as Brenda refused fascism indicated, it has happened and it continues to happen. Right here, like Brother Don Freeman said, what they did to those people in
East
East
Cleveland.
Cleveland was worse than what happened with Bonnie and Clyde. We talk about turning the clock back on ourselves. And if we understand Donald Trump has given homage to people to attack black, brown, and Muslim people. And if we don't have a solution, and my request is that at the end of this conference, that some solutions be proposed to stop these people. Now, I mean, like Brenda said again, the blue wave is not going to save us. If it were, Marsha Fudge would be here tonight. So I'm saying in sincerity, black people are going to have to stand up for our own rights and join those white people, just like the Freedom Riders. I just came from a Muslim forum over at East High School, and we need some money. We need some money, and the way to get that money is through recycling aluminum and plastic. So I'm just saying, I hope that something is proposed to begin to deal with these problems, because things happen, and if we don't get in, if we just sit around, and that's what's happening. We sitting around, we talking about it, we hashing it to death. And if we don't get out in the street and refuse fascism, and I'm a part of their group, is now in the streets, and we're going to have a groundswell. Donald Trump has nominated a man for the Supreme Court that does not believe that the president is above the law. Yeah. And he is a criminal, and he's going. He should be brought up on treason. Yeah. And I hope that a resolution is put together from this group. And this group is definitely, the Freemans are always involved in it. Put together a resolution to bring this monster up on treason charges, and let's see where the chips may fall. So I get
you.
about that. But I hope that a solution can be put together, that we don't just continue to go and hear things and then go home and eat whatever. But and we definitely don't need no more bootlickers. We definitely don't need no more bootlickers. So I
got you.
I hope we can.
Yeah, the one thing I want to say, and it probably reflects my own bias, I think we've got to be cautious about so-called white allies. For example, Maxine Waters has been very strong. I mean, she's been forthright in denouncing the president, but where are the pink pussy hats now? The white women that support her vocally, where were the white pussy hat women, pink pussy hat women, when Sandra Bland was executed? That's a bias I've got. Right here, brother.
Yes, sir. Thank you. I want to thank you guys for calling this meeting. I think that it was necessary. I think it was also that you all were able to pull out this type of crowd and chat with diversity. I know there are a couple of things that have been troubled in our history that has taken place, and they can have
aim at the building of the good things and allow those who have the expertise from this organization to organize committees that would attract other like minds and target those situations that we find unsettling and stay forward and focus on those things. Okay. And get those things done. But at the same time, the black community's problem is economic, you know, and that's the core of where your voice is lost in any situations when you don't have your economic structure able to foundationally support what your agendas are or what you want to move forward. So I think, you know, you guys did a great thing bringing forth this forum, and I believe that, you know, our job is to become more supportive to the younger generation. That's right. And have them become supported by this group, because these are the generators. You all have the knowledge, but the thing is getting behind the young ones here, allowing them to understand the struggles and give them the good energy. I know there's been some bad things, but everything isn't been bad.
I agree.
You know? So I'm thinking a redirection of understanding could be made out of this situation where we can line ourselves up and not so much be angry, but more aware and utilize the goodness of the joy of a good energy to build with and organize and communicate more with our neighbors, start with your street club, you know. But the main thing I think is the economic piece with the businesses opening back up in the community, because there's spaces to open a business in our community, spaces everywhere. And at the same time, there are youth that can be guided through those spaces through our leadership. So this is a good day for us. This is leadership. We have our attention. Instructions are needed.
Okay, let's take two more quick questions for a break, and then we are going to be hearing from the young people. Sister right over there. No, yes. Speak up.
I'd like to thank the panel for your input and your knowledge and wisdom. I want to thank that all of you and today I'd like to thank you for talking about the needs of our community that people are really aware of. My uncle was one of the young guys, Mr. Teddy. And so we grew up around over in Arkansas area and whatnot, you know. I remember telling my friends, I said, well, my uncle's rich. They said, oh, your uncle's not rich. I said, show me your money. And he pulled out that Kansas City road. And the rubber band on, you know. And that's the way they rolled back then, you know. And it was funny because when he passed away, they were trying to find all the money that he had. And Mama said, I don't think it's coffee. And he had coffee cans full of money. All of it, you know. But we have to stop criminalizing our children. That's right. Because I worked with kids when I was a little younger, and everybody
Okay, we have time for one more quick comment or question. Deborah.
I actually have a question. So I work in the mental health field, and there has been a recent study that shows that there's a new type of post-traumatic stress syndrome that is resulting from the police violence and police brutality. So we have a whole other issue of our youth that's going to be impacting and showing signs and symptoms of this. Now the question is, how do you eat an elephant? You eat an elephant one bite at a time. It is very easy to become very overwhelmed with so many issues. So there's a strategy called strategic planning. And my question is, what can we do to use the energy and the intelligence in this room, also combined with the faith-based community, to actually have a strategic planning to prioritize the things that we want to focus on first? I think one of the most effective strategic planning or effective strategic planning was the bus arrival, the bus
Boycott.
and it impacted economics. There are people that do not care about hating others. They don't care. They only care about the money. So the bus boycotts was effective because they stopped riding the buses and it hit them at the pocket. So I would like to know what we can do to actually have some strategic planning to prioritize and to come up with some specific action plans for the things that we prioritize. Yes, you say, what can we do? So that's the use of data, information. Hopefully we can get information, a database, regarding the people who are in this room, and we move it forward. We indicate what is most important. What are we going to prioritize? Put some energy behind that and move point by point by point to make some impact.
Okay. Don, you have the last word, and then we're going to take a
I
break.
just have to take this opportunity too, that you have to include what I stress. We must change the present mode of arbitration of police in the state of Ohio. That's difficult. It will require action by what is essentially the racist General Assembly of the state of Ohio. But that's one of the things we must do to end the impunity that the police have to just kill our people without being punished. Because once we change the mode of arbitration, then they can no longer count on the arbitrators to back them and overrule mayors and anybody that fires them. And they can continue to stay on the police force and stay on the streets and do whatever they want to do. That's one thing we must do. Change the mode of arbitration in the state of Ohio and make the state legislature do that. Difficult as it is.
Sister John.
I love everything you said. I just wanted to say, my husband was Robert Southgate. Black history was his life, his passion. And when I took that 519-mile Underground Railroad walk, it was because the ancestors spoke to me. And I want to have a promise from all Black parents in this room and wherever I walk that they are talking about the brilliant, ebony Black, beautiful, inspirational people that we came from. And I think it's got to be something that beside the anger, beside the talk of guns, beside all of what we need to do, we need to be teaching how wonderful Black people are, how brilliant, how beautiful they are, and that needs to be what our children need to absorb, so that when they think of things like good hair and bad hair, when they think of skin color and think that medium brown or half brown is better than jet black, that needs to be taken in to know who we come from, who they were in Africa, and who they were brought here and enslaved. You've got to talk about who we are. You've got to talk about who we are now and who we will be in the future.
I was just told that young people or young persons should end this discussion, so come forward, sister.
But my name is Chanel Miller. I'm a class of 2018 at Glenville High School. There were so many good points today at this convention and everything like that. And what I really want to pinpoint on is, like, me as a young person, I did not know about the Glenville riots or Glenville shootout in '68, of course, because, well, I grew up in a household where it was not taught. You feel me? Like, everyone on here just said that the whole point of history is to teach it, learn from it, do better, and make your future better. But if you talk to a child and they're ignorant about a situation, what do you expect for them to do? The whole point is for it to be taught, for them to make a better future for yourself. Me being a millennial, that is very important to me. If I sit here and go to my parents and say, hey, we need to do this, we need to do that, they'll be like, why should I care? And I actually get that from a lot of my peers, why should I care? You think it doesn't pertain to you, but it really does. Your education pertains to you. Your history of your neighborhood, your community, your area pertains to you. So when I hear all of these people that were around back then saying, Glenville was so vibrant, it was so lavish, it was so wonderful, you could get everything in your community, that is not the community I see now. That's not the education I have now. That's not the resources I have now in my community. It actually saddens me. But what I feel like today, if you look at everyone in this room, everyone knows someone that was around back then, or you were born during that time and period and you've seen it yourself. There are not that many millennials in this room right now. And this is something that needs to be taught to them, whether it's in a curriculum, whether it's in a household, parents, grandparents, aunties, uncles, cousins, something like that. This is something that needs to be taught, not just in school, but in a household. It is very important. So when I see everyone in this room saying, yes, we need to make a change, not only in our education system, but in our community and everything like that, everything starts at home. So if you let this child let it know be at home, and they get to where they are in life, like knowing this history, knowing where they come from, knowing this heritage, that's gonna give them success. That's gonna give them the drive to do better, to better their community. When I look at kids in my community, their main goal is to get out and not look back. And that's sad. It shouldn't be like that. Would you, how can I put this away? Would you let your kid be like, I don't like that neighborhood, I want to transfer to Shaker or Menor or Cleveland Heights, because you think that's a good education system for them, but yet you're letting the rest of those kids fail because that's your child, you gotta look out for your child. It should not be like that. It really does take a village to raise a child. So if this village is only looking out for their child in particular, that is the problem. That's where the fault is. Don't just take your child out and be like, hey, I'm gonna get a better education for my child. You're letting the rest of those children suffer. You need to come to these school board meetings. You need to come to meetings like this. Millennials need this. Because we are literally the future of politics. We are the literal future of education. If we really want to see change, make sure a millennial knows so they can be that change. Because right now, your time is no longer in the action. It is the time for you all to inform the millennial. And that needs to be it.